I would like to invite our chairperson, Dr. Tulika Chavan. I would request our chairperson, Dr. Tulika Chavan, to please take over the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So good morning, everyone. I would like to thank you all for joining us so early on Sunday morning. So yes, so as we all know, keratorefractive surgery ectasia is one of the most dreadful complication which a surgeon can think of. It's definitely a nightmare for both patients and a surgeon. So let's start the session with the hope of unraveling the enigma of ectasia. Without further delay, I would like to call upon Dr. Raghav, who is Associate Consultant in CFS in refractive and cataract services. He will try to decode the red flags in refractive examination with us. Raghav, over to you.
Thank you, ma'am. Good morning, everybody. Thanks to iOS for this great opportunity. So today I'll be talking about red flags in pre-laser vision correction workup. This, in my opinion, is the most important part of refractive surgery because the purpose of this is to find the right candidate who is right for refractive surgery, and more importantly, who is the right candidate to reject. That is much more important. So, what is a cornea that is predisposed to post-LASIK ectasia? It is a cornea that is already destined to manifest ectasia. That is cornea which have not yet developed the first detectable signs of ectasia. Secondly, a preoperatively weak but clinically stable cornea. That is, we have signs on the test, but the cornea clinically is strong, and a relatively normal cornea, but in which we do a high ablation. Now we start with the evaluations, going first into the history. What is the history of the patient? Surgical, medical, ocular surgical, ocular medical. The age of the patient, very important, because lower the age, higher the chance of ectasia. The sex of the patient, occupation, why that's important is depends on what the patient's occupation is. If the patient is a driver who drives at night, and we must consider many factors before taking that patient up, because that patient might not enjoy the full benefits. Refractive stability of the patient, expectations from the refractive surgery, and the general and ocular health of the patient. Then we have some absolute general health contraindication like an autoimmune or immunosuppressive disease, because these can interfere with healing. If the patient is pregnant, then we must wait for 6 months after the patient stops breastfeeding. Also, systemic steroids can also alter the healing. Relative health contraindications include the patient who is on tricyclic antidepressants, because this patient might have different expectations from surgery. So we might have to address that post surgery. Then diabetes and active atopy are also relative contraindications. A patient who is epileptic might not be able to sit through the procedure. And a patient who has a history of hepatitis B and C might be a potential risk to the surgical staff. Absolute ocular health indications are diabetic retinopathy, like we discussed, glaucoma, patients with thin cornea, like keratoconus, history of ocular inflammatory disease, because these can get precipitated after surgery, hepatic ocular disease, because this might also recur after surgery, Sjogren's syndrome. Fuchs is a relative contraindication, because this could lead to flap instability post surgery, unstable refractive error, and a visually significant cataract. Relative ocular health conditions that are contraindications are a dry eye, because the patient will obviously have some dry eye after surgery, blepharitis, this must be treated, nystagmus, and squint. Now, ophthalmic examination will include a BCVA, refraction, this is a must, we have to see the stability of the patient. Then ocular dominance testing if we are planning a monovision or a presbyoond for an elderly patient. Tonometry, we need to know the exact IOP, because evaluation of IOP post refractive surgery is a challenge. Tear film assessment, anterior eye examination, dilated fundus to check for any weakness in the retina, which has to be treated preoperatively. Pupillometry is very important in the scotopic conditions, because this patient with a higher pupillometry or a bigger pupil in scotopic conditions might have some hyroid aberrations. The pachymetry, and of course, now we'll go on to the tomography. So this is the normal pentagram of patient, giving the anterior curvature, the thickness, the anterior and posterior flow, float, and the Bellin-Ambrosio enhanced ectasia display. We'll go into detail. This is the general first scan of the patient. This gives us the quality specification of the pentacam, the Q value, the center of the pupil, center of the cornea, the thinnest point of the cornea. Each of these points has its own significance. Now, these are the K ratings, the K1, Km, and this is the Km max. So a Km of less than 48 is a definite red sign. And also difference between the Kmax and K2 of more than 1 diopter is also another red flag for laser vision correction, which we have to look out for. This is the sagittal curvature map, which gives us the steep axis, the flat axis, and it mentions the eye, the orientation, nasal and temporal, and also the two opposing points on the 5 mm circle are very, very important. This dotted line gives us the size of the pupil. Now, information we can get on the curvature map is the keratometry, the K1, K2, Km, and the Kmax, the corneal apex and the pupillary center, and the pattern of the of this curvature, that is the IS, that is inferior superior or superior inferior asymmetry. This is the normal symmetric bow tie with the rule astigmatism. This is a normal symmetric bow tie with against the rule astigmatism. This is the bow tie with an oblique astigmatism. A skewing of more than 30 degrees is described as abnormality. This is asymmetric bow tie with a skewing. This is asymmetric bow tie with superior steepening of more than 2.5 diopters is considered abnormal, and asymmetric bow tie with inferior steepening more than 1.5 is abnormal. These are the things we have to consider. These are all abnormal features like a junction or a vertical D pattern, a smiling face pattern, a vortex pattern, a claw pattern, and a butterfly pattern. Now, elevation maps, these are basically maps that give us the surface of the cornea in relation to another reference surface. It gives us the anterior elevation map and the posterior elevation map. So this is the reference surface, and if the cornea is steeper than this, we will have hotter colors, and if it is flatter than this, we will have cooler colors. This is a reference image. It gives us the normal is a symmetric hourglass figure with a dotted pupil. So normal cutoff values for a myopic population are between 8 and 18, and for hyperopes are between 6.5 and 27.8. Now, next important landmark is the pachymetry. It gives us a corneal apex, the thinnest location, and the two opposing points on the 5 mm circle. Thinnest location, center of the cornea. So a difference of more than 0.5 micron on the center of the cornea and the thinnest location is very important. So difference of less than 10 micron between the thinnest point and the corneal apex is something we have to consider. Abnormal thickness of less than 470 in a normal tomography. Difference of 30 micron between the two eyes. So now this is a condition that shows the center of the cornea and a skewing of the thinnest location. This is something which is very important. The y less than minus 1.06. Now, what are the enhanced ectasia screening options that we have? One is the Bellin-Ambrosio enhanced ectasia screening. This gives us, in reference to a best fit sphere, and we have to look out for the final D value of more than 2.6, pachymetric asymmetry at the thinnest point of more than 25 microns, anterior thinnest elevation point more than 8 and 18 like we discussed, and an abnormal PTI and a CTSP, that is the percentage thickness increase and the corneal thickness spatial profile. This is separate for a hyperop population. So now the corneal thickness spatial profile gives us the average thickness along 22 imaginary circles. And if that is outside the 3 standard deviations, that is something we have to look out for. Similarly, for the percentage thickness increase, how the thickness increases from the center to the periphery also has to be within the 3 standard deviations. Now, early detection can be done by looking at the corneal biomechanics. This gives us how rigid the cornea is to a puff of air. This, as you can see, a normal cornea with a 542 thickness with just a 15 IOP, whereas a cornea of 400 micron with just 5.5 milligram of mercury can get so altered by a puff of air. So this can be used in conjunction with the pentacam to give us many more indices. Like this is the Corvis, that is the biomechanical strength of the cornea, compared with along with the pentacam gives us the bad D value, and the Corvis gives us the CBI, and in conjunction we have the TBI. TBI less than 0.3 is abnormal. Epithelial mapping is something also very important. It compensates for stomal irregularities. Inferior thinning corresponds to thinning cornea, and it is used for screening of early keratoconus and PMCD. Now, Bowman's layer thickness mapping on the spectral domain OCT is also something that is coming up. It gives us localized relative inferior thinning because we know that the Bowman membrane is injured during refractive surgery. Now, this is, of course, something from Restriers, that is the Ectaria risk scoring system by Dr. Randleman. It gives us the important factors we should consider, like the abnormal topography, lower residual stromal bed, young age, preoperative corneal thickness, and high myopia. This is though not used these days, but still gives us a very good idea of how to proceed with refractive surgery. And the percentage tissue alter, that is how much tissue we are altering per se the thickness of the cornea. It is given by the flap thickness plus ablation depth upon the total pachymetry. It should be less than 40%. More than 40% is always a risk for ectasia. On the horizon, I want to conclude by saying that now what we are coming to an area of artificial intelligence, where we will not have humans sitting on the computer and looking at the pentacams. We can just feed the patient's data, and the computer will be doing the handy job for us, and it will give us patients who are at risk and patients who are good to go. Thank you. I would like to conclude my slides, and I would now like to introduce Dr. Tulika Chauhan, who is the fellowship coordinator at Center for Sight and being a very good cornea cataract refractive surgeon. Over to you, ma'am.
You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much, Raghav. And it was such an elaborative talk. So I will share my screen here. So I hope my screen is visible.
Yes, Dr. Tulika.
Yes, okay. So today I'm going to speak on the borderline cornea and when to proceed. Just a moment. So corneal ectasia is a life-threatening complication of keratorefractive surgery, which is characterized by progressive steepening and thinning of the cornea, which leads to irregular astigmatism, loss of best-corrected visual acuity. It can present days to years after the procedure, and the prevalence is theoretically low, estimated between 0.04 to 0.6%. So are we underestimating the number or are we understating the numbers? So we don't have the answer for this right now. Clinical significance it's very important because this condition is preventable, and most LASIK patients are young adults in whom the burden of condition is greater. Still question abound. What is borderline cornea? How thin is too thin? How thick should the cornea be to maintain the structural integrity? And how deep can the surgeon go? If we have answer for all these questions, then why do some patients with abnormal topographies not develop ectasia following keratorefractive surgery, while some patients with normal looking eyes do? So are thin cornea an independent risk factor for post-LASIK ectasia? The answer is probably no, because corneal thickness alone is not a measure of cornea's inherent structural stability. Crosslink corneas are stronger, stiffer, more compact, but they are thinner. And keratoconus can be seen in the eyes with the thick corneas. So all our questions are not answered yet. Red flags are not only the thickness of the cornea, but the shape and size of the cornea, which can be assessed by the curvature and the diameter. Pachymetry, of course, is a risk factor. Comorbidities like autoimmune disorders, and the scarred cornea, for example, post-surgery or post-infections. So as Dr. Raghav already covered this, I would like to enhance the point that analysis of intrinsic biochemical properties and alterable biochemical properties are very important. And intrinsic biochemical properties can be assessed from corneal topography, age, and the alterable biochemical properties can be assessed from percentage tissue altered and residual stromal bed. And these factors, along with amount of refractive error, are basis of most of the ectasia scoring system. So I'll sail you through some clinical scenario in which I find difficulty in making my decision. So let's see that how I decided on patient's treatment on this. So yeah, before that, we'll discuss the definition of residual bed. So is there a magic number? There's no magic number. Residual bed should not be less than 50% of original thickness. Since the structural support for the cornea has been shown to reside in the anterior cornea. For example, if the pre-surgery pachymetry is 546 micron, then post-ablation residual bed should always be more than 273. Each surgeon must develop his own safety limit for residual bed, but this should not be less than 300. But literature says that this residual bed can be from 250 to 300 micron. Percentage tissue altered is how the preoperative corneal thickness combined with excimer laser ablation translates into postoperative corneal biomechanics. PTA matrix representing the percentage of anterior corneal tissue that is modified during refractive surgery. PTA takes into account the integrated relationship between preoperative corneal thickness, ablation depth, flap thickness, and final residual bed. It is calculated as flap thickness plus ablation depth, and it's divided by central corneal thickness. It should always be less than 40%. It's an independent indicator of postoperative corneal ectasia, and PTA more than 40% is a negative prognostic indicator. So this is first case scenario in which a 32-year-old woman present for LASIK consultation with hopes of being less dependent on glasses. She does not wear contact lenses. On external examination reveal excellent exposure with corneal diameter of 10 millimeter. Anterior segment evaluation is absolutely normal and fundus is absolutely normal. So the refractive screening of the patient is in front of you. She has moderately high myopia with best corrected visual acuity is better than 20/20. Pachymetry looks fine, above 500. So what are my challenges in this case? Relatively steep corneal curvature, small corneal diameter, thin pachymetry, large pupil. So I have a borderline shape, size, and the thickness of the cornea. But during the screening, we got that our residual bed is 326 micron in right eye and 333 micron in left eye, which is above 50% of central corneal thickness. So it is under the criteria. And the PTA is around 35.2 and 34.2, which is way less than 40%. So surgical option given to patient are keratorefractive procedure and the lens procedure. My reservation with microkeratome LASIK in this case is that flap diameter is dependent on corneal curvature and the diameter. The flap must be large enough to accommodate large treatment zone, yet not so large that it extends into the limbus. And the slight flap decentration, there's a significant risk of limbal invasion and hemorrhage. So the option given to patient were femto LASIK or any flap surgery. So flap diameter is independent of corneal curvature and the diameter, and it can be preset. But again, the limitation is the centration, and the flap edges close to limbus cause limbal bleeding and AC air bubble in the small white to white and corneal diameter. Surface ablation, there's no flap related risk. A large zone with an added blend can be achieved. Excellent centration can be achieved without any difficulty. The limitations are regression in haze, phakic implants, of course, the cost, and then the intraocular complications are the issue. So the treatment plan, patient opt for the PRK with the ablation zone of 6.5 with blend, and we have RSP post PRK 434 micron in right eye and 439 micron in the left eye. The take-home message is recognize the special challenges posted by the patient with microcornea. Surface ablation remains an important keratorefractive option in selected cases. The femtosecond laser is safer than microkeratome in patient with small steep cornea because it offers more control over the flap diameter. The second case scenario, a 25-year-old woman, RGP user for 11 years, and she wanted to go for LASIK. We asked her not to wear contact lenses, but she wore her contact lenses. Rest of the examination looks normal. And when she came to us, this is a refractive screening, and I find a red flag here in topography, and she has moderately high myopia as well. So my challenges with this case, will there be adequate stromal tissue for laser ablation to correct this amount of myopia and astigmatism? With spherical equivalent of -10 and 9.5, a conventional laser procedure estimate to remove 120 and 114 micron to provide complete correction. RSP is 285 in right eye and 293 in left eye, but it is more than 50% of central corneal thickness. PTA is 44.6 and 43.3%, which is above 40%. And the corneal topography show inferior steepening along with somewhat high K readings and slightly thin pachymetry. So it's called for the critical evaluation for subclinical keratoconus. Is it a subclinical keratoconus or the contact lens Warpage, since she is using contact lens for a long time? So we asked her to have a post-CL free period, and we repeated her topography in 3 weeks, and topography were absolutely normal. And this is her refractive screening post 3 weeks contact lens free period. So concern with keratorefractive procedures are borderline stromal thickness for laser vision correction, PTS more than 40% increase the risk of post of ectasia, and the future enhancement not possible without enough corneal stroma. So my treatment plan for this patient was phakic lens implant, and patient is doing good with 20/25 in right eye and 20/25 in the left eye as well. There's no night vision problems here. The take-home message, the differentiation of clinical keratoconus from contact lens induced corneal warpage is important for both accurate and surgical correction and safety. The phakic IOL implantation is a good option to discuss with patients who have any suggestion of subclinical keratoconus, and the phakic IOL produce equivalent or superior vision for patients with adequate borderline stromal thickness for laser vision connection. Third scenario is a 30-year-old Asian woman interested in refractive surgery, and she has a palpebral pressure which is very small, lids are somewhat tight, and the corneal diameter is 11 millimeter. And rest of the examination looks normal. Her refractive screening shows this, and this is her topography. So my challenges with this case, that relatively thin pachymetry, increased risk of night vision problem with high astigmatism. Pachymetry maps reveal the thinnest portion of the cornea to be displaced inferotemporal in right eye and slightly displaced in inferotemporal in the left eye as well. So let's see, this is a pachymetry, which is displacement. Examination in favor in this patients are both best corrected recognition is better than 20/20, stable refraction for 2 years, normal curvature elevation maps, normal Bellin embrasio enhanced ectasia screening, RSB is 353 in right eye, 343 in left eye, which is more than 50%, and PTS 29.6 and 32.1%. Pachymetry curves follow the mean and substandard deviation curves. So conclusion is pachymetry findings alone are not sufficient for surgeon to reject the patient as a candidate for refractive surgery. So the treatment plan, the patient opted for PRK, and the RSB is 458 in right eye and 457 in the left eye. And of course, the patient was discussed about the risk of haze and topical steroid. So thin pachymetry, tight lid, small palpebral fissure, small corneal diameter. PRK seems to be the better option than LASIK sometimes. And the post-op vision was 20/20 and 20/25. Right eye is plano and left eye is minus 0.5 with plus 0.5 at 145 degree. So take-home message is a careful analysis of corneal topography, power elevation, and thickness is especially important in highly astigmatic patient to rule out sign of pre-existing ectasia. Highly astigmatic patients should be presented with realistic vision expectation and warned about possible night visual symptoms. Successful correction of high astigmatism has the potential to improve near as well as distance vision in young person. So the conclusion, I'm concluding my talk with the clinician must not rely solely on one measurement or data point in determining the patient's suitability for corneal surgery ectasia. Nevertheless, with improved screening protocol, enhanced understanding of corneal biomechanics, and judicious application of patient selection criteria, we can strive to reduce the incidence of postoperative ectasia as much as possible. Crucial is to understand, recognize, and accepting its risk factor, critical towards achieving a significant reduction in occurrence of this adverse event. Thank you very much for your patient listening. So I hope I'm still audible.
Yes,
to all of you.
Dr. Tulika.
Yeah. So I would like to invite Dr. Ritika. She's a senior consultant in cataract, cornea, and refractive services in Center for Sight. She's going to cover extra procedure for us in today's session. Dr. Ritika, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Tulika, for putting a lot of things together for us always, including this session. Is my screen visible?
Yes, Dr. Ritika.
Thank you. Now, as keratorefractive surgeons, we all fully know that we don't understand ectasia completely, and there are various factors that may be at play that don't allow us to accurately predict all cases that will develop ectasia. Therefore, that is really a bugbear for keratorefractive surgery. An adjunct modality that has brought on some excitement about possibly reducing the risk of ectasia is combining cross-linking with laser vision correction, the extra advantage. So I'll be taking you over the experience that we've had with this technique and a small literature review of the same. Now, when you do a keratorefractive surgery, you're obviously going to weaken the cornea. The mechanisms by which the cornea will weaken is the fact that you're going to be subtracting tissue. You may be causing damage to the Bowman's membrane, and you will be creating vertical and delamination cuts. Flap creation is one of the strongest causes for biomechanical weakening, and the biomechanical weakening is maximal in LASIK. Hence, the LASIK extra procedure was the first to really hit the imagination and was popularized by Vitro. Not only the weakening by the keratorefractive procedure is at play, there are also inherent factors that we've already discussed in the first two talks that predispose a patient to developing ectasia. These include a high correction, thin corneas, abnormal topography, history of eye rubbing, pregnancy and hormonal imbalances, and certain other risk factors. So we've long been using cross-linking to treat ectasia in the form of stopping progression for keratoconus. When we have the opportunity to treat even post-LASIK ectasia with this, is it possible to shift from treating to preventing by using cross-linking? That is the question that extra bases itself on. So we have seen that by cross-linking the cornea, you're not only going to be reducing the risk of corneal ectasia, but also the risk of refractive regression by minimizing the stromal bounce back and also the epithelial regression. So you are going to get stable corneas and stable refractive outcomes post-refractive surgery. Nothing comes without a downside. Cross-linking has safety concerns in the fact that we know that cross-linking causes some amount of haze and scatter. And if you cross-link with refractive surgery, you are bound to also risk the complication of haze. Also, we have seen that cross-linking flattens the cornea. And if this progressive flattening continues, the refractive outcome may be compromised by a shift towards hyperopia. So what is a compromise that we look at? Though LASIK extra was started as a treatment popularized by Vitro for all patients, it is at present restricted to those who we feel are at higher risk for ectasia. This includes younger patients, higher myopic correction. Hyperopia is an indication because the amount of regression that happens after hyperopia is more. Borderline topography. Here I'd like to have a disclaimer that though some people have used the technology of extra to treat form first and patients who have subclinical keratoconus, we at our practice would want to stay away from keratorefractive procedures in such a topography that has evidence of form first keratoconus. And these are only the borderline cases which are a little iffy to go or not to go that we treat with extra. A family history of keratoconus, persistent eye rubbers, etc. can also be treated with this modality. This is a nomogram given by Dr. Sheetal Barar et al. From Netradhama, where they have listed the risk factors, including young age, high correction, residual stromal bed thickness being reduced, or topographic or biomechanical indices, which make you wary. And the presence of 2 or more risk factors would make this patient a candidate for the extra procedure. The extra procedure, like cross-linking, utilizes 2 components, the riboflavin and the UVA radiation. Note that when the LASIK extra came in, it was important to note that dextran causes DLK. So we shift to dyes which don't have dextran. The dye used, it could be saline-based and is embedded right into the stromal bed, kept there for about 90 seconds and then washed. The flap is then reposited. The energy that we use is roughly about half the energy that is used in conventional cross-linking. The reason for that is we feel that using half the energy will minimize the risk of haze, and that the fact that you don't need full energy because you're just trying to give back the biomechanical strength that the procedure has weakened. And this is not inherently as diseased a cornea as would be there in keratoconus. So this is the energy of 2.7 joules per square centimeter, half of the 5.4 that we use in the routine treatment of patients with keratoconus. Why don't we cross-link through the flap? We don't want to remove the epithelium. We have an interface where we have access to directly embedding the dye into the stroma. And this helps you cross-link without cross-linking through the flap and do away with the possible complications of flap shrinkage. Now, post-LASIK results with the extra procedures have been quite heartening. There have not been any significant reports of haze, and the refractive results have been quite stable and predictable. So the extra procedure is giving you the advantage of biomechanical strengthening without any significant side effects of haze or needing to develop a new normogram for the refractive correction. Do note that there have been case reports of ectasia even after LASIK extra when done in cases who have an obvious keratoconic map. So do stay away from keratoconus. Use it for only borderline cases. This again has shown that you can follow these patients for years, and the stability that they maintain, particularly in hyperopic LASIK, is remarkable. This is the finite element modeling. What this basically does is try to reconstruct the cornea post the extra procedure. And it has shown that the LASIK extra corneas are stronger. So if you're exposing them to higher IOP, they're less likely to deform, basically meaning they're stiffer, less likely to become ectatic, but the refractive outcome has not changed. So you now have a technique where you can easily add on without really worrying about the refractive outcomes and giving you the peace of mind that you have lowered, if not eliminated, the risk for ectasia. Now, coming to the flip side, like we don't understand ectasia fully, we still don't understand the perfect protocol or the perfect patient for extra. So you'll see a wide range of protocols being used. The amount of energy that has been used has varied from 0.8 to full 5.4, most commonly hovering around the 2.7 mark. So depending on the machine you have, you can use power and time settings to deliver this energy. And most results have been rather gratifying. Though if you see the number of eyes in each of these series are limited to less than 100. And this is basically a combination of various experiences that is making us believe that this technique works. PRK extra is something that I think has become more popular than LASIK extra, because if you are dealing with a patient who is more likely to develop ectasia, you don't want to make that patient undergo a flap, which causes the greatest amount of biomechanical weakening. So PRK extra is reserved for patients who have borderline topo or thickness, and patients who sometimes need retreatments and may have a lesser residual stromal bed. We debride the epithelium. The soak time can vary from 15 minutes to 90 seconds, depending on the riboflavin that you use. And like I said, the energy that you use is about half. Here, we normally use 9 milliwatts for 7.5 minutes. You can use 18 milliwatts for 3 minutes or 30 for 90 seconds, but this is a energy setting that we are comfortable with. You see here, like Raghav has discussed, this is again a borderline topography with a D map, which is in yellow and is a young patient. So is a good candidate for taking up for PRK extra. The flip side of PRK extra, like that of PRK, is the risk of haze. Though most reports have shown it to be safe, there are reports of persistent haze, which has been noted in 3 to 4 case reports. The haze usually resolves within 1 to 3 months, but may require longer duration of steroids. We routinely use mitomycin C in PRK extra cases, but the study out of Eye Foundation at Coimbatore showed that they had no haze despite not using mitomycin C. The hypothesis shared by them was that cross-linking itself causes keratocite apoptosis. And since you don't have these activated keratocytes, your risk of haze is less. But we routinely have found no problem using MMC and do so in our practice with PRK extra. The procedure really of our choice, which blends in the advantage of no pain and biomechanical strength, not as weak as LASIK in all possibilities, is SMILE. SMILE is performed in cases and where you have a higher refractive error with stabler outcomes, unlike PRK. We use 0.25% riboflavin with saline, and we push it into the interface, give it about a 90-second time to soak, and then wash it with BSS. And then the UV light is applied, again for half the energy setting of 2.7 joules per square centimeter. Just taking you over this procedure, we all know SMILE is performed with the femtosecond laser. This is the Visumax with the patient interface latching onto the cornea, the posterior pass forming the lenticule refractive cut, and the anterior pass giving you the cap, the side cut, which gives you access to the lenticule. Now, the dissection is performed, and once you know the planes, you're able to free up the lenticule and remove the lenticule. What you have here is you've created an interface, and the side cut here being lesser than LASIK possibly gives you lesser biomechanical weakening. Now we take this patient under the microscope and instill riboflavin. I would like to point out that do respect the interface, and you don't want anything other than riboflavin. Even small fibers entering into the interface must ensure that the interface remains clear post the wash. Once this has happened, you just subject this patient to cross-linking as you would routinely do with the altered energy settings. Our experience and that of many others has been rather heartening with SMILE Extra. In fact, there has been a case series published with form thrust cases taken up for SMILE Extra, which have not progressed over months. However, again, I like to add the disclaimer that you do this at your own risk and classically reserve this for borderline topographies, not frank Casey. So all in all, I'd like to conclude that ectasia remains the bugbear for keratorefractive surgery, and there is a ray of hope that cross-linking with the extra procedure offers. The flip side is that this is still not randomized and standardized to the extent that we want it, and the energy settings vary widely. Our recommendation would be to use half the energy settings without any alteration in the refractive normogram. Be wary of haze post PRK extra, and we would recommend use of MMC. And in most cases, if young borderline corneas with high refractive errors, you'll have gratifying results. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Ritika. It was pretty insightful for all of us. I hope it will help us to decrease the number of ectasia cases in our refractive patients. And yeah, now I would like to invite Dr. Kiran Kirtani. She's a consultant in cataract and refractive services in Center for Sight. She'll be sailing us through the role of biomechanics in the refractive patients. Kiran, over to you.
Good morning. Is my slide visible?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, good morning. So as we are trying to find out what is when the right tends to go wrong in post-laser vision correction, the role of biomechanics cannot be considered to be just of a silent spectator, to be very, very honest. We have been knowing through these previous 3 talks that in excess of 4 million people globally undergo elective refractive surgery, out of which 0.04 to 0.06% patients go on to develop post-surgical ectasia. As Dr. Ritika rightly pointed out, more than 96% of the cases of ectasia belong to the category of patients who have undergone a LASIK, because LASIK gives rise to a weakening by 55 to 65% of the corneal elastic properties, whereas PRK leads to only 20% weakening. So what if we could find out at the nascent stage itself the reasons why this corneal lamellae are not able to hold the strength enough for these patients to move on with a normal life? So we all are aware that the ultrastructural changes precede the biochemical process and are responsible together for the biomechanical stability. And once this stability goes away, there is an alteration in the corneal shape, giving rise to optical aberrations, and eventually leading to the poor vision quality, image quality, and finally a need for transplant. Unfortunately, the way the cornea is being diagnosed for the earliest cases of keratoconus is exactly the opposite. It first evolved from the slit lamp examination, moving on to topography, moving on to the corneal thickness and tomographic analysis. And now the unmet need of biomechanics is being evolving and being understood to its T. So the current standard of care, though, is involving only topography, tomography, and pachymetry, following up with an abnormal or normal differentiation, giving rise to a standard treatment. If the potential of biomechanics is completely met, we will be able to identify subclinical keratoconus and customize these tissues early with cross-linking and avoiding these patients from undergoing a keratorefractive procedure. So what is important for us here to know is how do we understand the biomechanics itself of the cornea? since the most common instrument being used is the dynamic Scheimpflug tonometer or Corvus ST, we'll also understand the parameters. Also, by few examples, we'll know how to integrate this instrument into our daily clinical practice. The famous statement by Cynthia Roberts always will hold true. Cornea is not a piece of plastic. Cornea is a viscoelastic tissue. Elasticity meaning that it's the ability of the cornea to come back to its original shape on being deformed, and viscosity meaning the resistance that the cornea is offering to any deformation. And all of these are being provided by corneal tissue stroma itself, the ground substance being responsible for the viscosity and heterogeneity, and collagen fibers for the elasticity, along with the hydration response to the shear strain that the cornea tends to go through in and out during the day. Thus, corneal shape is not only a geometric figure, it's not only corneal curvature, diameter, and thickness, but also an interplay of the intraocular pressure and the material stiffness which is coming from the fibrils, extracellular matrix, and the hydration. So if we understand how do we clinically apply this biomechanics, a focally reduced modulus of elasticity at any point in the corneal tissue will give rise to an increased curvature, redistribute the stress and strain, and give rise to further increase in the curvature, making it a vicious cycle. Thus, if we know about biomechanics, we'll be able to understand the mechanical intraocular pressures. We'll be able to find out keratoconus very early. It will help us in our glaucoma managements also. And not only that, the response of corneal cross-linking and improved prediction of refractive outcome will be one of the major things that we'll be able to achieve. There are two devices which are currently commercially available to understand biomechanics in vivo. One is the Corvus ST, that is the corneal visualizing Scheimpflug tonometer, and the earlier one is the ocular response analyzer, which came to market in 2003. ORA was a non-contact tonometer, which through a pulse of 20 milliseconds, pulse pair of 20 milliseconds, which was being visualized through an IR emitter, and the rebound was being detected by a collimation detector, giving rise to first flattening peak 1 and a second flattening peak 2 or second applanation event. The difference between the two being called as the corneal hysteresis. And with the mathematical calculation, the corneal resistance factor was also being found. The hysteresis, resistance, pressure, and thickness that came about with the ORA was good enough for us for characterizing viscoelastic properties. However, not good enough for us for detecting the preclinical keratoconus cases. And it was found that the sensitivity and specificity of CH and CRF was only 78.9 and 63% in order to find out whether this patient could develop an ectasia post-surgery or even otherwise in life. Then came the newer solution in the form of Corvus ST. Corvus also has an air puff which goes onto the cornea, but the beauty of the instrument is it has a high-speed Scheimpflug camera which is visualizing 4,000 frames per second through the 8 millimeter diameter, unlike ORA which is only for 3 millimeter. And there are 140 images which are being captured over a 30 millisecond duration. It's already approved by FDA for density and for thickness, but in European markets and in India, it is being very well used for detection of early ectasias. The dynamic corneal response that occurs, that is the first applanation, is studied for its length, its velocity, and also the time that is taken to the formation. Also, there is a deformation which tends to occur. So the deformation amplitude, the radius, the peak distance of the epices, and the area under the curve or the radius of curvature is also understood here. Once the cornea tends to come back to its normal shape again, there is a second applanation event, which also gives rise to information regarding its length, thickness, and the velocity. So the machine is able to give us the dynamic corneal response parameters, an intraocular pressure parameter, and corneal thickness measurement at the same go. So we get three major reports by Corvus, which is DCR report, Vinci-Guerra screening report, and the Ambrosio-Roberts Vinci-Guerra tomographic biomechanical assessment. You'll see one by one. But there's a new parameter from 2019, which is appearing to be very promising, and this is known as the stress strain index. So the dynamic corneal response studies not only the deformation amplitude and applanation length, it also inverses the concave ratio and gives us an integrated concave ratio. There is a availability of a dynamic video at the same time, which you can see. and a biomechanical corrected IOP can be obtained from the DCR report itself. The Vinci-Guerra screening report was basically a combination of the 4 parameters which were coming from the Scheimpflug tonometer itself. And in addition to that, the single frame picture of the horizontal profile of from center of the cornea to the periphery of the cornea, how the cornea is increasing in its thickness, gave rise to the Ambrosio relational thickness in the horizontal meridian. And these parameters combined gave rise to a very good index, which is known as the corneal Corvis biomechanical index. The integration of the Oculus Pentacam and Oculus Corvis gave us a comprehensive report in the form of a CBI, a BAD-D, and TBI, as already mentioned by Dr. Raghav. The tomographic biomechanical combination can be a killer when it comes to diagnosing these cases and preventing the mistakes which we have been doing in the past. The latest stress strain index is developed by Ahmed El-Sheikh. Ahmed El-Sheikh is very well known for developing the biomechanical IOP, which is independent of the corneal thickness factor. The beauty of stress strain index is it's independent of the intraocular pressure, the corneal thickness. It has got basic correlation with age. So it's actually a measure of the material stiffness. The normal value of stress strain index is known to be approximately 1. And it is a very good parameter which can also help us in monitoring the pre and post laser vision correction changes, and also what is going to happen once the patient undergoes a cross-linking. So as you can see here, the SSI index itself is able to tell us that whether the cornea is stiffer or it is softer or it is not significant. So there's a comparison map also available with that. So as per the review article published in 2019, the parameters of the Corvis ST, out of all the parameters, a cutoff value is 0.5 in CBI, and in TBI, it was found that the Ambrosio cutoff of 0.29 can give us a good, indice wherein we can follow through with the patients. So I have just 4 examples. The first example being absolutely normal patient with a normal pachymetric normal fraction. And you can see the Pentacam is absolutely normal. You can also notice the Corvis is normal, the TBI, the BAD-D, and the CBI are normal. So we can, in such case, proceed with surgery easily. In the second case, you can notice that the patient is having cylindrical error only in the left eye, and the corneal thickness is borderline, with the Pentacam showing a borderline IHT. However, our CBI is also borderline. The TBI is going towards the red. It's crossing 0.3, 0.5 by a lot of amount. Even in the left eye, the TBI is showing to be 1. So now in such a case, we can't think of a surgery at all. We need to monitor this patient and consider this patient for a cross-linking in future if there's any increase. The third case shows a 6/6 part vision in the left eye. Again, the left eye is having a frank keratoconus with a thickness of 485. The right eye seemed normal. However, when we see the CBI here in this patient is around 1. So this is again a red flag. We are not supposed to touch this patient. So Vinci-Guerra et al. Had given up cases of 12 cases with BAD-D less than 1.6, but keratoconus on CBI. This is my final case. And again, the Pentacam BAD-D here were abnormal. However, the TBI and CBI were absolutely normal. So here you can combine it with a cross-linking procedure. The refractive procedure can be performed with confidence. The extra confidence can come from the extra procedure.
With all due respect, sorry, Dr. Kiran, could you just please sum it up with next?
That's my last slide, ma'am.
Okay, no worries. Go ahead. Thank you.
So the hidden secrets of the cornea can be unveiled with biomechanical indices. However, in future, we are looking forward to supersonic shear wave imaging, surface wave elastometry, and Riva optical microscopy. Thank you for your time, and sorry for the delay.
Thank you, Dr. Kiran. It was so wonderful talk. And structural integrity of cornea is indeed very important factor to consider before any refractive surgery. So yeah, with that note, I would like to invite Dr. Hemlata Gupta. She is our Senior Consultant in Center for Sight and Cataract, Cornea and Refractive Services. She will talk about diagnosis of post-laser vision correction, post-ectasia cases. Dr. Hemlata, over to you. Ma'am, we can't hear you.
Dr. Tulika, you are inaudible. Am I audible now?
You are audible, ma'am.
And my screen visible?
Yes.
Yeah. A very good morning to all of you. So I'll be talking about how to diagnose post-LASIK ectasia. And as we all know, it's the most feared sight-threatening complication, which is characterized by the progressive steepening and thinning of the cornea, causing progressive decreased uncorrected visual acuity and corrected visual acuity. It was first described by Theo Saylor in 1996. And exact incidence of the ectasia is still not known because many of the cases are not published or reported. The estimated incidence is somewhere around 0.04 to 0.6%, and average time of onset is 15.3 months, and the earliest case reported was at 1 week only. Now, the clinical presentation can vary. The most important thing is, unlike keratoconus, it is always progressive. So you have to keep that in mind. Progressively decreasing this corrected vision, there can be stromal thinning, anterior and posterior steepening, Bourke's triad, rarely acute eye drops if it goes undetected, and corneal perforation. Rendelman defined corneal ectasia in 2008 as inferior topographic steepening of 5 diopters or more compared with the immediate postoperative appearance, loss of 2 or more lines of snellal acuity, and change in the manifest refraction of 2 diopters or more of either sphere or cylinder. Now, the main goal in recognizing ectasia is to prevent misclassification as myopic regression and thus prevent retreatment, which would worsen the visual outcome by hastening the progress of ectasia. So, early clinical detection of ectasia after LASIK requires very high clinical suspicion. Because the topographic changes initially are subtle, there can be a very mild increase in irregular astigmatism. This can be maybe accompanied by focal steepening, often inferiorly. These changes slowly progress and become more well-defined over a period of time. But in advanced cases, changes can be indistinguishable from keratoconus or PMCD. So with characteristics suspicious for possible ectasia, one should not undergo any enhancement surgery. So as Kiran and Raghav have also mentioned, that ectasia can still occur in patients without any preoperative risk factors. So your clinical suspicion has to be very high. So for example, this is a patient who presented with a to get the refractive surgery done. If you look at the topography, interior refractive maps and the posterior float and corneal thickness, everything seems perfectly normal. And this patient had moderate refractive error of 0.75 diopters to 1.5 cylinder in the right eye, 1.25 spherical with 0.75 cylinder in left eye. And if you look at the topometric maps, everything again looks normal. All the parameters were within normal limits. And Ventacam of the left eye was essentially within normal limits. The patient opted for microkeratome LASIK for both the eyes. And our patient was doing well till 6 months in the post-operative period. And after 6 months presented to us with -1 cylinder refractive error and wanted recorrection. Now what to do at this stage? Is this ectasia or simply regression? If you look at all the maps, if you look at the refractive map, there is a little inferonasal steepening and the K max was around 44 diopters and with a 0.9 astigmatism. So it could be regression, could be ectasia. At this stage, you never proceed with the re-enhancement and just observe how these changes are going to progress over a period of time. So we told the patient to come back after 3 months. Patient came back after 6 months and again there was an increase in astigmatism to 1.3 from 0.6 and there was increase in Kmax readings and inferonasal steepening also progressed over a period of time. So these are the serial topographic maps of the patient from pre-operative to 9 months post-operative, 1 year. At 1 year post-operative period, the changes were obvious and we advised the patient to undergo corneal collagen cross-linking. But patient had some, patient was lost to follow-up, came back again after 6 months. And at 1.5 years post-op, it was a frank ectasia. At this stage, actually, the patient underwent CXL procedure. And this is the pre-C3R, the top one is pre-C3R pentacam. And this is the post 9 months post C3R pentacam. You can see that this improvement in all the parameters on corneal topography. So there can be certain post-operative factors that you need to keep in mind when a patient comes with regression. One is pregnancy, because relaxin, there is increase in release of relaxin during pregnancy that inhibits the collagen remodeling and can lead to ectasia. Then adenoviral keratoconjunctivitis, again, there is increase in the release of the immunomodulators that can also cause progression of ectasia. Then chronic eye trauma, rubbing, increase in intraocular pressure, all these things you need to keep in mind. Now, if you want to diagnose early ectasia on bad software, then if you look at the first picture, this is always going to be abnormal, because bad is comparing the data to the normative data. So post LASIK surgery, your data changes. It is comparing the data to the normative data. So it's always going to be abnormal. But if you see something like this, it's definitely a sign of ectasia. SMILE is known to be more biomechanically stable as compared to the microkeratoma flap-based procedures, but still there it is not free from ectasia. Many cases of ectasia have been reported post-SMILE also. So this was a patient who had moderate myopia and came for the refractive surgery. All the maps were within normal limits. So the patient opted for SMILE procedure, and this is at 3 months post surgery. So you can see that as early as 3 months, ectasia can progress. The Kmax was 46.6. It was more than preoperative pentacam, and astigmatism increased to 1.2 diopters. And if you look at the central area, there was a little irregularity with increase in steepening in the central area. Again, we wanted the patient to wait for some time. And at 6 months post-operative, all the changes progressed. There was increase in astigmatism to 2.2 diopters, increase in Kmax to 53, and you can see the central cone appearing. So at this stage, the patient had frank post-LASIK ectasia and underwent CXL procedure. So by now we know that only topography is not enough to give us all detailed information. So we are looking at corneal biomechanics, epithelial thickness, spatial profile, or Bowman's membrane thickness to detect early ectasia. Now, as Raghav has told, corneal biomechanics might be good for detecting early cases of keratoconus, but it is not sensitive when it comes to subclinical keratoconus, normal patients, or patients with very early ectasia. Tomographic biomechanical index is a better option because it's calculated using artificial intelligence approach to optimize the ectasia detection. It's a combination of pentacam with Corvus biomechanics. Epithelial mapping is a newer concept which is based upon the concept that the epithelium remodels in response to the underlying stromal surface irregularities. And we look at the central and the regional epithelial thickness profiles, and we can see inferior thinning and epithelial hyperplasia in early cases of corneal ectasia. Even before the epithelial changes appear, there could be a Bowman membrane disintegration on high resolution spectral domain OCT, and that will be also seen as localized relative inferior thinning. So ectasia definitely is declining over a period of time because we now have better screening tools, more precise microkeratomes, and with the introduction of femtosecond laser, already there is 50% reduction in the cases of ectasia. So the take-home message is always re-examine the pre-operative topography, compare it with the post-operative topography when the patient comes with regression. Look for the asymmetry between two eyes and always think twice before doing redo. There's no harm in waiting for a few months to observe the changes, and you can prevent ectasia that way. Thank you very much for the kind attention. That's it.
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks a lot. Indeed, prevention is better than cure, and we don't want to face such patients in our day-to-day practice. And I hope that early diagnosis help patient if they are dealing with this problem. Thanks a lot, ma'am. I would like, I would like to invite Dr. Pratik Teotia. He's a senior consultant in Center for Sight in Cataract, Cornea, and Refractive Services. He will take us through the managing of post-laser vision correction ectasia. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Tulika. Can you see my slides?
I can, sir.
Okay. So I would be speaking on managing post-laser vision correction ectasia. No financial interest in the presentation. So post-LASIK ectasia typical presentation is with progressive corneal thinning and steepening, usually inferiorly with loss of UCV and BCVA associated with increased myopia and irregular astigmatism. Good thing for all of us is that incidence is very low, 0.04 to 0.9%, and average time of onset varies from 1 week to 62 months. Risk factors have been taken off, such as keratoconus, high myopia, low residual stromal bed thickness, excessive ablation or thick flap creation, small optic zone, formifrosty keratoconus, PMCD, and undetermined factors. Regarding ectasia management, first thing is to arrest the progression of ectasia, which can be done by collagen cross-linking and its modification. And the second part is visual rehabilitation with contact lenses such as RGP, mini-scleral, or scleral contact lenses, intracorneal ring segments, and in advanced cases with deep anterior lamellar keratoplasty and PK. Sometimes combination of treatment is required for final visual rehabilitation. So first we stabilize the cone to prevent progression of keratoconus, then we flatten the cone and reduce the refractive error with Intex and other ICRS. Third, we can correct the refractive error and aim at metropias once the stabilization of keratoconus is done with the help of ICLs. And in advanced cases, then we can choose between DALK and PK. Collagen cross-linking is the modality which increases the rigidity of corneal collagen and thus reduce the likelihood of further ectasia. Along with combination of UV radiation and photoactivation with riboflavin, production of oxygen-free radical is done, and there is formation of cross links between CH2 and H links in the collagen fibers. So there are various machines. The conventional one uses Dresden protocol, in which the duration of treatment is more, and the accelerated one which has less duration of treatment. But what we routinely use is the intermediate duration treatment, where 9 milliwatt for 10-minute exposure is given. The most effective is the conventional one. The accelerated one are found to be less effective, and the reason being responsible is the time duration for which oxygen comes in the contact with the cornea. So post-LASIK ectasia patient, they do not respond as better as the keratoconus patient. So there are certain reasons that there are biomechanical differences caused by the LASIK flap, possible differences in the riboflavin diffusion rate in post-LASIK corneas, especially at the flap interface. Intrinsic pathophysiological differences between keratoconus and ectasia may all contribute to the different responses, and so the response is not as robust as in keratoconus patients. Intracorneal rings, they act as spacing agents which flatten the cornea. They are made up of PMMA. Different types are available. The common ones are Intex, Ferrara, and now the Indian BioRing is also being used. Intex work by shortening the arc length of the cornea. It flattens on and in between the segment tips and cause steepening on the segment body. Depending upon the diameter, the smaller the diameter, the greater is the correction, and the greater the thickness, the greater is the correction. So this is a video showing Intex being done. So after the docking is done, a good applanation is applied. And once the proper centration is done, then we start femtosecond laser firing to create these circular channels. The channel is opened by a vertical opening incision. Then with the specialized spatula, we open both the channels and carefully implant the segments first in the difficult direction, then in the easy direction. It is always preferred to implant the thicker ring first and the thinner ring later on. And then the opening channel is sutured. This is the Schimflug imaging showing the intracorneal ring segment in position. So how to go ahead with intracorneal ring segment and CXL? Should we go with sequential CXL and ICRS or simultaneous? So CXL followed by CRS progression is first arrested by collagen cross-linking and corneal rigidity is improved. Corneal shape normalized by intracorneal ring segment. Mechanical flattening effect is less than predicted ICRS, but there is delay of 6 to 8 months in visual recovery. Simultaneous CXL and ICRS gives maximal flattening effect with ICRS and further progression arrested by collagen cross-linking more than a simple additive effect when done simultaneously. Now coming to this case, patient left eye when presented to us had K1 of 40.2 and K2 43.1. But patient was lost to follow up, and when she presented back to us, there was progression of keratoconus and C3R was done in these settings. But post-pregnancy, patient had progression in the left eye, while the right eye, this was K1 and K2 were 39.9 and 41.9 at presentation, but post C3R it improved to 37.7 and 40.2. But during pregnancy, right eye was stable because this patient had undergone both C3R and Intex in the right eye, and it was stable during pregnancy. So what was this case taught us that ICRS is a useful treatment modality for post-LASIK ectasia compared to C3R alone. We also know that prevention is better than cure. So depending upon different keratorefractive procedures, since the anterior cornea is the strongest because of the oblique arrangement of the corneal fibers, in PRK, we don't have to create the flap, so we leave more residual stromal bed. In LASIK, both flap and ablation leads to the loss of anterior stroma, but in SMILE, both Bowman membrane and anterior stroma are left behind, and the lenticule is usually taken from the mid and posterior stroma. So compared to LASIK, PRK and SMILE has more biomechanical superiority, and the role of extra has been taken off by Dr. Ritika very well. And these are the indications for doing extra procedures preoperatively while treating refractive procedures. So take-home message is careful screening necessary before planning refractive surgery. PRK and SMILE presumed to have reduced risk of ectasia due to better corneal biomechanics. New modalities of combining CXL with laser vision correction is available, and Intex plus CXL still give a good uncorrected visual acuity after ectasia. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. That was wonderful talk. And I hope we should not face such patients, and we don't need to treat such patient in our clinical practice. So as you said, prevention is better than cure. So better screening is important. So now can we start the discussion? We still have 20 minutes left.
Yes. So good thing about post-LASIK ectasia is that incidence is very low, and with the advent of better diagnostic investigations, we are able to pick up subclinical and formaphorestic keratoconus cases quite better than the previous mode of investigations. And doing these extra procedures had also further reduced the incidence of ectasia. But still many things are unclear, and with time, we will be able to find out what are the reasons which are responsible for ectasia in cases which have normal topography, normal thickness, and all the parameters which have been taken care of despite they develop ectasia.
Definitely, sir.
I
Definitely.
have a question for you, Dr. Prateek. Would you recommend the Intacs for all patients of ectasia, or we can just simply do CXL and observe?
See, if the vision is good with glasses, if the patient is able to manage good vision with glasses without and uncorrected vision is decent enough, I would like to go along with plain C3R in cases of normal keratoconus. But in post-LASIK ectasia, it is advisable that we should give Intex in all the cases, because these cases, they are less effective compared to keratoconus to C3R. So in post-LASIK ectasia, it is advisable that Intex should be given to all the cases because it brings the cornea back to its normal shape, and it causes some corneal collagen remodeling also, along with C3R, which makes the cornea more compact and strong.
And how to take care of the flap while inserting Intacs?
So we should always, usually the flap diameter is at a slightly larger level. It's around 8.5. And Intex is usually inserted at a diameter of 6 or 5.5 mm. So we have to center the Intex along the pupil, and usually inside the flap only we usually create the channels. But while doing C3R, care should be taken that we should debride the epithelium only inside the ring margins. We should not go above the ring margins, so that the flap is taken care of, and we should not disturb the flap while doing C3R in cases of Intex plus C3R.
Thank you, Dr. Prateek.
I have a question now. So would you like to assess the depth of the initial flap before creating the channel for Intex?
Usually channels are detected at a much deeper level. They are created at 70% depth. Okay, and the flap is usually quite superficial. It's 110, 120 or 130 level. So channels, they are detected at a deeper level and they are inside the flap margins. So no need of taking care of flap thickness, because we know that it is already superficial.
Okay. So I have a question with Dr. Raghav. So what is the clinical significance of Rendelman ectasia scoring like systems which were proposed long ago? Is there any significance in today's scenario?
Ma'am, like I mentioned that the Rendelman, this ectasia scoring system was done way back when. So it was basically a culmination of many, it was a review article and they looked at many studies, and if you look at the scoring system, they have included many things which we'll never include in our refractive surgery today. Like they had a residual bed of less than 240 also in many cases, and they went up to 12 to 14 diopters ablation and age, and also they did not have very high-end tomography machines to find out those very subtle changes in tomography, that is the form first day, and they did most of them in the microkeratome with a flap. So the ectasia in the ectasia cases are much higher in Dr. Rendelman's review. So it is considered in addition to the factors that we take into consideration nowadays. So it is nothing to do, we don't follow that scoring system right now, but we follow the points that was created by them. That is the residual stromal bed, the flap thickness, the age of the patient, the ablation, and the topography. All that is still valid, but like you said, there is no magic number. And also, like Mr. Churchill said, no crisis. Crisis that was created, that was used by surgeons today and built upon.
So is it Raghav's voice is breaking or only my?
Yes, sir, Raghav's voice is breaking.
Yes.
I have a comment to make on this, Dr. Tulika. Rendelman actually, whatever criteria they have made was purely on microkeratomes. So they, at that time, femtosecond laser or SMILE was not there. So I don't think it's valid these days, because we are working with much better technology now.
Yeah. And one more point I want to add in this, that microkeratome flap thickness is not predictable. So even if you're dealing with a borderline corneas and you make a microkeratome flap, it can be much deeper and it can encroach posterior stroma as well. So that may be the reason for ectasia also in such cases. So that is why it is not that predictable with that scoring. But anyways, as you said that we have a better screening system. So yeah, we are working with that now. So my next question is to Dr. Kiran. So what's your procedure of choice to assess the biomechanics, or do you do biomechanics in all the patients, all your refractive patients?
Well, given an option, if you have an access to a biomechanics system, it's always better to integrate. Two hands would work better than one because there's no single machine which can point out everything for you. So tomography can just be a surrogate marker of how strong your cornea is. Biomechanics can give you a little more insight. Till now, we don't have a single machine which will be able to do everything for you. So yes, if you do have a Corvus, it definitely helps you, in getting a better picture. But if you don't have, then at least in borderline corneas, it is at least imperative that you try and get one. Get a report of one.
So Dr. Tulika, in our
Usually we do have
Safdarjung
it.
Enclave Center, we are doing Corvus ST in all our LASIK
our
workups. Yes, so it's a good choice if you have all the machines and under one setup. But if it is not there, then in borderline cases, at least you can ask to get Corvus ST done.
Okay, I have a question with all the panelists. Suppose if our only biomechanics are borderline or it is not normal and everything else is absolutely okay, since the data is not, we don't have excessive data in biomechanics machines. So should we go ahead with the procedure or should we just postpone the procedure just on the basis of biomechanics?
So it depends how your patient trusts you. So if you can convince the patient for quick follow-ups, okay, then you can go ahead with the, if all the topography and other parameters are okay, then you can go ahead with the refractive procedure and you can ask the patient for quick follow-up. And in case if there is any ectasia you can detect early on, then you can treat the patient, but you have to inform the patient also. But if your patient is fussy, and then it's better to delay the procedure, repeat the parameters after 6 months, or you can give the option of extra to be safer on medical legal sites. What would you say, Dr. Hemlata?
I think going in with the extra procedure is a better option in case of any doubt. So,
or delaying the procedure for 6
or
months.
Delaying the procedure, we can observe after 6 months. Usually doesn't, the changes do not progress over a period of 6 months. If the cornea is biomechanically weak, it is weak.
Yes.
Yeah, understand until you fire the laser, changes are not going to develop. So waiting is not going to help much. Either you do it the extra procedure or
So
that is
if topography is okay and there are abnormal parameters on Corvus ST, then you can go ahead with the
or I would just do surface ablation procedure if the cornea loss.
So surface ablation alone or with the
Alone.
extra
Alone.
Okay, alone.
I have a question for Dr.
Sorry, I would just like to add that the new parameter, that is the stress strain index, will be of value in this particular scenario because stress strain index will be able to look at the progression early. So this is biomechanical progression. We are not looking at a topographic or tomographic progression here, but stress strain index repeated over the course of 6 months or 1 year in such patients who have a borderline cornea. If it is indicating that the cornea is turning more towards the softer side, it's rather not wise to proceed for any kind of a refractive procedure, or maybe combine it with a cross-linking procedure once we have established a non-progression.
But we have to see the repeatability of these new indices, okay? Because these are very new, and in practice we don't know how repeatable they are. So we have to see patient as a whole along with all the parameters, then we can take decision. Just on one parameter we cannot rely. It's a good to have new parameters, but their repeatability has to be checked.
Okay. Dr. Raghu, you're asking some question? Oh, he's okay.
Yes, ma'am, I want to ask you, how do you accurately rule out a contact lens warpage?
So when you go for the tomography, in tomography, the curvature map will show the abnormalities, but your elevation maps and posterior elevation, anterior elevation will be normal if it is a pure contact lens warpage. So patient will give you history of contact lens, and usually the contact lens history are usually hard contact lens for longer time. Patient is using for like 12 to 18 hours, more than that also. Some patients are sleeping with contact lens on. So such kind of history you'll always get. So before making a diagnosis of any subclinical keratoconus, we should always have a contact lens free period before we go to the diagnosis. And curvature maps will only be abnormal and other maps would be normal in tomography. You can misdiagnose this if you're dealing with the type of topography in which the elevation maps are not available. And in exteriors, a lot of patients have been treated for keratoconus on the basis of this without seeing the elevation map when the elevation maps were not there. So a lot of patients were mistreated. They were wrongly treated for collagen cross-linking just on the basis of curvature maps. So now with the better screening system, you can assess it's a contact lens warpage or it is the subclinical keratoconus.
So Dr. Raghav, one question for you.
How far?
What is the contact-free period should be there for soft contact users or for hard contact users to rule out corneal warpage?
So for soft contact lenses, 4 to 6 weeks, and for hard, 8 to 10 weeks is what we keep.
For soft contact users, I think 1 to 2 weeks is fine, and for hard contact lens users, it's 2 to 4 weeks. And for soft, we can do as early as 3 days also. What do you say, Dr. Tulika?
Okay.
Sir, totally agree. But in my experience, sometimes I feel that contact lens warpage is there. Your curvature is not normal even after months of contact lens free period. So what you said is true for most of the patient, like maybe 95% of the patient, but 5% of patient do behave like that. The curvature is not normal because that contact lens had a pressing effect also. So hard contact patients, sometimes they show warpage on tomography for longer time. Dr. Hemlata, if you want to add something in this, like if
the role of warpage comes if you want to see whether the cornea is borderline or not. Suppose your cornea is fine, I mean, is showing warpage changes, you can still go ahead with the surgery. It's not going to change the outcome. But if the cornea is borderline, then you'll have to wait for some time for the warpage to go.
Definitely.
That's
so
a question for
curvature,
Pratik.
yeah. So
Sorry,
some curvature map, you'll keep seeing those colors, but if you check the numbers on the curvature map, they looks pretty normal. Like they are 42, 43, but the colors are hot colors. So along with the colors, we should always see the numbers as well. And with the time, those colors might be darker or hot colors, but the number changes. So you will come to know about this.
And one thing I think you covered in your presentation, that corneal warpage will lead to changes in the surface maps, not in the posterior curvature maps. So that can be identified with the topography, that only the anterior maps are showing changes, but the posterior map is stable.
Yeah, so these days with tomography, we don't find that problem of misdiagnosing the patient. And if the person is a refractive surgeon well versed with the tomography, contact warpage should not be missed in today's days. And the history is always very important part of this kind of examination. Yeah. So we have just 50 seconds left. If I can ask one question to Dr. Hemlata, if possible. So Dr. Hemlata, the case which you showed, it has only one risk factor, that is against the rule astigmatism in that patient. Apart from that, everything was normal. So what do you suggest? Like suppose if we get the rule astigmatism, which is found in pretty normal people, also in young patients. So should we avoid surgery or should we go ahead? You're mute, ma'am. You're mute, I guess.
That is a very difficult decision to take. So that should not be the indication of not doing the surgery. So if you have these are kind of very, very rare cases, it's not a common thing. So we have been doing these kind of cases in routine, and this unfortunately presented with the ectasia, but doesn't happen in routine. So we should continue doing surgeries in irregular astigmatism.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, all of you. I think it is very critical to screen patients before refractive surgery to avoid this dreadful complication. And once it's happened, early treatment is the rule. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank
And
you.
I hope we all.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Dr. Tolika, for the wonderful session. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.